community. Oh yeah, we were going to record this. I'm glad you remembered that, Francis. Great timing. So when it comes to YPAR, different scholars have conceptualized it as having benefits at sort of three different levels. The first is that participating in YPAR can often offer benefits to students themselves. There's been some empirical studies that highlight the ways in which being a part of a YPAR project can support students' feelings of empowerment, their development of agency, because it's a really great leadership opportunity. It can also help with things like critical thinking skills. Some folks have also looked at the ways in which YPAR maps on to things like, social studies curriculum. So we know sort of at the most micro level, it can benefit the students themselves. The second is given that YPAR focuses on action research, you're working with the students to identify a research project to, improve conditions in their community, try and create change. It can also be a promising way to address problems within settings. Adam Voigt, who was involved with this interest group for many years, has done some studies as well in this area, looking at YPAR as a tool to, improve school climate, identify an issue on campus, then make it better. And then the last sort of area of influence that people conceptualize YPAR as having a role in is improving the validity and relevance of findings. I know for myself, when I started doing YPAR, I was at that point in time in like my early 20s. I was working with middle school students. And the truth is just, middle school has changed a lot since I was a middle school student. And so one of the unique affordances of doing YPAR is we can, have young folks involved in the research process from the very beginning to ensure that the way we're, wording our questions, designing our study are in line with what they think is going to generate the best results. And so in that way, it can also be helpful for, just getting better data too. In terms of the importance of school climate, so again, these may be things we're all sort of familiar with, but it's certainly been well established that the environment influences well-being and that, schools contain much more than just sort of the pedagogical aspects in terms of how they influence young people. There's also all these relational aspects. And in particular, I focus on early adolescence, due in part because of what we know about the unique importance of this environment development match during middle school. In particular, I use Eccles' stage environment fit theory a lot, looking at some of the ways in which middle school environments are often, designed in ways that are not too supportive of young adolescents' developmental needs. Additionally, we know that school climate is often experienced differentially based on identity, with some like Voigt and Megan O'Malley, who's also part of the SIG, an article they wrote that looked at the experience of students of color compared to white students when it came to their perceptions of school climate, and the existence of racial microclimates, where we sometimes see students who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or students of color having lower perceptions of the school's environment when based in the same school compared to their white and higher socioeconomic peers. And then the last sort of environmental consideration that informed this study was the reality of COVID-19. This was a study that was done in the spring of 2021. And we know that school climate drastically changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, the implementation of virtual learning or the implementation of hybrid programs, it drastically changed the school environment. And we went from having shared physical spaces where students were all together to them being in their individual homes where resources may vary greatly. And we also know that research has showcased that this shift exacerbated existing issues of educational inequity, especially when it came to things like, access to technology and the ability to fully participate in class. I'll also note, if things come up in the chat, like clarification questions, I may not see them, Francis, because I'm sharing my screen. So if there's anything important, feel free to interrupt me. But yeah, so there were two main research questions that I had with this study. The first was trying to analyze how do middle school students understand, experience, and seek to improve their school's climate during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second was how does participating in a YPAR project impact middle school students' sense of empowerment, mattering, belonging, and perceptions of school climate. So with this, I wanted to build on the existing literature that had explored, in a somewhat new way, how YPAR can help to improve school climate. And also, in addition to looking at, perceptions of school climate, I wanted to also bring in some other aligned constructs, things like mattering and belonging, which I think are really well aligned with the relational components of school climate. And then similarly, empowerment, which is, well aligned with YPAR and also can be related to some of the school climate elements of, students having a voice in the rules and things on campus. So this study was conducted in partnership with a Title I middle school in California that I've been working with for a number of years at the time of this study. And so we co-designed the recruitment process for this study with different groups on campus. Like we talked to teachers and administrators and counselors because we knew we'd have a smaller sample size of students that could be involved. And we wanted to make sure that there was adequate representation of different groups on campus. So we did some targeted recruitment efforts with certain programs and classes, things like their dual immersion program, as well as certain electives and after-school programs like AVID. And so that recruitment process was co-designed with school staff. And we ended up with 14 students that were consistently in the YPAR project throughout its entirety. All those students identified as male or female. It was a 50-50 split. It was majority 7th graders, followed by 8th and 6th graders. And it was mainly students of color, the majority of whom identified as Latina, which is representative of the student demographics of the school as a whole. So as far as what happened, so the students met twice a week with the adult research team for a 12-week period from March to June in 2021. And those meetings were held after school via Zoom for 45 minutes. In those meetings, students learned about the research process. They got to pick a study on which to focus their study. They designed and then implemented that study. And then lastly, they shared their results with a group of school stakeholders. All those meetings were recorded and transcribed. And then the students completed pre and post surveys where we collected demographic information. We had measures on empowerment, belonging, mattering, and perceptions of school climate. And then in those post surveys, we also asked them open-ended questions about their experiences of being in the project. And the meetings were facilitated by me along with a team of undergraduate research assistants, 2 of whom were former middle school. They had attended, they were college students at the time, but they had attended the middle school themselves. So they also had some, insider expertise. So this was a mixed methods study. It utilized a convergent triangulation mixed methods design, wherein I was collecting qualitative and quantitative data at the same time to then be merged together for the generation of meta inferences to really get a holistic view of the impact of YPAR. So for the data sources, we had that survey data I mentioned, and then because we were recording all the meetings, we had the meeting transcripts. We also saved the Zoom chat, and then the undergraduate research assistants generated field notes. And so when it came to the analytic approach for the qualitative analysis, codes were generated inductively, being emergent and grounded in the data. For the quantitative analysis, this was a small sample size, so that was a little bit simplistic in terms of what we could do. So it was mainly just descriptive statistic analysis and then paired sample t-tests to look at, pre and post scores and our constructs of interest. And then the data sets were merged together to see how the findings complemented or contradicted one another. So moving into the results, so as far as the process, it was important first for students to understand school climate conceptually. So we introduced students to the topic of school climate. This meant, doing some presentations. We watched some videos. And then we also had them discuss their school environment pre-pandemic. Because I've been working with the school for a number of years, we had done some survey studies prior to the pandemic starting. So I shared the results with the students and got to see, how they thought things were different or similar now. And then once I felt like students had a good grasp on school climate as a concept, they had some time to brainstorm one issue that they felt was important to the school. And then they got to come back and share that at a meeting. And then the students reviewed all the issues to identify patterns. Something that's important regardless of the age that you're doing YPAR with, but especially with middle school students, is just making sure that, there's a lot of scaffolding of, increasing things we're asking the students to do to ensure that they are able to, use their voices and feel like they are able to, grasp the curriculum. So students were allowed to think of, any issue they wanted at the school. The study was very open-ended, but there were a couple patterns that emerged very early on when it came to what the students were interested in. For example, one student, Maria, said, and these are pseudonyms that we're using, I saw, including myself, a lot of people said the lunch area, and then a lot of other people said the lunch, like the food that they serve at lunch. So I think those could be combined together. Another emerging theme that a different student, Chloe, observed was a lot of people think that there needs to be better communication between teachers and students who are online because there's online engagement and teachers forgetting to unmute themselves. So again, even though there was sort of anything that students could decide to focus their study on, there were 2 main issues that they decided to consider. The first was about the school lunch, and the second was about student engagement. So to move the students a little bit further along to think about, if we were going to do a study, what specifically would we want to focus on within these 2 issues? Then the students spent some time over a couple meetings discussing why they thought these issues were important. On the issue of school food, a student, Catherine, shared, we need more variety for gluten-free, vegetarians, vegans, and also for preference. It would be a lot less food waste if there were more options and people could pick what they wanted, and for health reasons and allergies too. A student, Hayden, shared, students online mainly, but also sometimes in person, can get left out. And we thought it was an important thing to research because it affects the lives of the students and it affects their grades, which are very important. So because the students were equally split on these two different topics, I offered them the choice. We could, either have two studies that we did, or where we'd have, the group broken in half, or we could just focus on one topic. And so despite identifying these two issues, the students decided collectively that they would want to focus on just one. And we were always doing democratic decision-making processes when it came to these decisions, things like voting. And so then the students considered various factors as a group in order to decide which topic to select. And again, power sharing is really important in YPAR between, the adult facilitators and the students. So again, all these structures for the decision making, including democratic processes, and then also were designed by students. And so as the students moved into trying to decide which topic they would focus on, we started to see them develop sort of like a critical perspective of school climate in terms of thinking about some of the different complexities of the issues they were observing. For example, a student, Chloe, shared, I think that a big factor into not being able to pay attention online is the Wi-Fi, because I know in a bunch of my classes, people are always getting kicked off because of their Wi-Fi, and then they don't know what's happening. So I think a better thing to do than research would be to give everyone Wi-Fi or something, but I don't know how we would do that. So ultimately, after the students had had their discussion process, it came to a vote, and the school lunch topic was selected for their study, winning about 69% of the vote. The rationale that the students gave for their choice was that they were more confident that this issue would be relevant after virtual learning. Again, the study took place in the spring of 2021. So some students were starting to have access to vaccines, and they were seeing, that they may be back in school the next year. There was also the belief that this issue had greater potential for improvement, going into some of what Chloe shared on that previous slide about, what are some of the issues impacting online engagement. And they also felt that improving the school food may also impact issues of student engagement. So they felt like it was sort of like a double whammy. Of note, the majority of the student population at this school qualify for free or reduced lunch, so a lot more students were eating the food. And also in California in particular, there were increased food offerings during the pandemic in recognition of the food insecurity a lot of families were facing. So moving from deciding that issue into what is, how we're going to design our study, one of the first things I did was try and build a collaboration with the cafeteria to ensure that anything we were focusing on for our study was something that could actually be changed. So the students partnered with both school and district food services staff, and we even were able to have a presentation by a nutrition specialist as well as the head of cafeteria, so we could understand things like school lunch policy. For example, one of the things the students were hoping to change was to have the school lunch include water as an option instead of milk. But unfortunately, we learned that, they're legally obligated to provide milk. So those are the kinds of things we were trying to learn from that to ensure that I wasn't setting the students up to advocate for change that wasn't actually going to be implementable. And then because by the second half of the spring semester at the school, there was an option to do a hybrid program and come on campus a couple days a week, we did arrange for a cafeteria tour for in-person students so they could actually see how the food was prepared. So with this, baseline research conducted by having these conversations with school staff, the students identified three main areas of focus for their study. They wanted to improve the quality of the lunch food, they wanted to reduce food waste on campus, and then they also wanted to improve lunchtime seating for students. And then the methods that they chose to explore these areas, the first was food waste observations, wherein the students were going to school in person, observed which cafeteria items were thrown away and how often. So we had a schedule where they would stand by certain trash cans with notebooks and note what students were throwing away. And then we also had a survey that students created, included open and closed-ended questions asking things about, school lunch behaviors, what were they eating, how often did they eat the school food, and that was shared electronically with all students on the schools through the school's online system, and it was completed by just over 20% of the school. Once the students had completed their data collection, we worked together on analyzing their data. And at the end, they conducted a presentation of their results for school staff. This included administrators and teachers. And then to ensure that the district had this information as well, they shared a results document with food and nutrition services staff. The summer after the study concluded, I was meeting with the school principal, and she shared with me that all school sites in the district had had the number of their cafeteria staff cut in that upcoming academic year budget, except for this one middle school site, which she attributed to the YPAR project. She felt like because we had this relationship with the district, they knew that the students here really cared about the food. And then at the end of that academic year, we were able to apply for a grant from the California Department of Justice to fund a continuation of the project, which was received that fall. And so that's how the YPAR impacted the school, moving into the students as individuals. When it came to empowerment, we found that students had a statistically significant increase in their feelings of empowerment. And we also saw their feelings of empowerment reflected through their responses to some of those open-ended questions. For example, a student, Diego, shared when asked what he liked about being a part of the group. My favorite part was when we got to actually do something way more productive and get to observe all the waste of the food that was happening, because it made me want to see what we could do to at least help the problem resolve. Similarly, Eduardo shared when asked what he learned during the project, I learned that if you work hard, you might be able to change something. We also saw feelings of empowerment in their engagement in participatory behavior and the way in which they express their sort of perceived control of the space. For example, a student named Danny was very instrumental in designing some of our decision-making processes, particularly when it came to thinking about which topic they would focus on. In the meeting, he shared, what we could do is send people into breakout rooms, ask them what topic they want to be in, and then send them over to the breakout room, and then make up like a few good points. And then you come back and you share them. And then whichever one sounds the best and would help the community and make more of a difference at the school would be the one we picked. Similarly, Catherine was also instrumental in directing some of those processes when it came to advocating for focusing on 2 topics versus 1. She shared one reason why we might want to do just one research topic would be because it's a bit more efficient to get more ideas and concentrate our energy and all our thoughts into that one subject. It would be almost more powerful. So when it came to merging our data together on the construct of empowerment, we found that across multiple metrics, students displayed considerable shifts in their empowerment, notably in their development of advocacy and leadership skills. We also saw that students had a statistically significant increase in their feelings of mattering. And again, we saw this displayed in their responses to some of those open-ended questions. A student, Danny, shared about what his favorite part was, that you took our ideas into consideration and were open to all ideas. Similarly, Mia shared about what she learned. I learned how to collect important data and to value everyone's opinion, showing also how she came to have a sense of mattering for others. And then we also saw mattering displayed in the meetings themselves when it came to value for the opinions of others within meetings. In particular, Mia shared when she was advocating as to why she thought maybe they should focus on 2 topics. 2 topics would be better because I feel like more students will voice their opinion. And similarly, Chloe shared when they were having this discussion, I wouldn't feel bad if they don't pick our idea because both of them will do something good for the school. So I don't think it really matters which one we pick. I mean, I would rather choose lunch, but they're both good. And so here, the qualitative results showcase more of students' gains in mattering by feeling value and adding value, while the qualitative results highlight students' growth in mattering through, feelings of importance and needs fulfillment. So in this way, the qualitative and the quantitative results help to expand on one another a little bit and show different dimensions of mattering. When it came to feelings of belonging, we didn't see a statistically significant shift in feelings of school belonging, though we did note that students vocalized agreement with one another and affirmation for each other throughout the project. And we also saw some feelings of belonging to the YPAR group specifically showcased in students' responses to some of those open-ended questions. As a student, Riley shared, I love just going to it and being part of it and coming up and agreeing on ideas or thoughts. So in this way, we saw some amount of sort of discordance between our qualitative and quantitative findings. In particular, the quantitative results were really focusing on overall school belonging, where there we didn't see any significant change, but we did see in some of the qualitative results, students potentially increasing in their sense of belonging to the YPAR group specifically. And then when it came to perceptions of school climate, we didn't see a statistically significant change in the perceptions of school climate. Though we did see that students did express a shift in some of their perceptions of the institutional environment of the school, namely the cafeteria, because they were able to get so involved and spend time with cafeteria staff. For example, as one student, Hayden, shared, I loved learning about how about the cafeteria and how we can implement new cafeteria items. So here we saw, again, some expansion. Both qualitative and quantitative results demonstrate a lack of change in school climate perceptions, though the qualitative findings show some sort of developments of new understandings of how the school works. So in terms of some of the overall takeaways, we found that school climate during virtual instruction included both the in-person and the online environment, and that especially at this point in the COVID-19 pandemic, students saw school climate issues as dynamic alongside of the changes the school was undergoing due to things like, the availability of vaccines. We also saw that the students in this study adopted a critical perspective of what aspects of school climate were within their control now that some of these issues were housed at homes rather than, everyone being in the same school setting. And in particular, the ways in which issues at homes highlighted some inequities, things like Wi-Fi access. We also saw the importance of school food during this time, especially school lunches being an equity and an inclusion issue, in particular for this school where a lot of students qualify for free or reduced lunch. And like I mentioned earlier, California schools offered free meals to all students during the pandemic. So we had likely even more student engagement with the school meals. And this district in particular also provided take-home food for students who were experiencing food insecurity. Um, and so all in all, we know that food became a greater equity issue during the pandemic, and that there was increased food insecurity, especially amongst Latinx families, which make up the majority of the school population. And despite this short timeline that we had with the students, originally the study was designed to be a year, but due to the pandemic, we shifted to just half a year. And, we just had this small group of only 14 students. We still did see that the project was able to generate some change at the school site, and that both qualitative and quantitative analysis showcased change in students mattering and empowerment, which I thought was promising. And I think ultimately this comes together to highlight YPAR as a potential intervention for improving school climate and supporting early adolescents' developmental needs, thinking about sort of that initial level of impact for YPAR and that community level. The study is, of course, not without limitations. We did have a small sample size of just 14 students, though the students' data that they collected included a larger group. Additionally, participation in the YPAR project was limited to students who could join the meeting. Pre-pandemic, we were designing this as a study that would take place during the school day so we could increase access to the project, but the pandemic meant that it happened after school. And we understand, due to not all students being available to join meetings after school or not having devices, that did limit who could be involved. And that ultimately, our results are limited to the perspectives and experiences of students involved, as well as this one school site. But ultimately, in conclusion, we did find that meaningful change occurred to the site and participants, even with a small group and during somewhat less than ideal circumstances for facilitating YPAR. And so ultimately, I think, this study really highlights the importance of including youth voice in issues that impact their lives and, some of the power of thinking about YPAR when it comes to improving and understanding school climate. That is the end of my presentation, but welcome any questions that you may have.
So if you have any comments, thank you so much for that presentation, Jennifer. That is great. If you have any comments, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you should use that. While you're thinking about that, I just wanted to ask a question myself. And Jennifer, my understanding was this was done through Zoom during the sessions, right? Now, how would you think this, I mean, YPAR itself is quite interesting and helps to empower the students in enabling these changes. But I'm wondering nowadays, would you still continue to use Zoom today, or would you advocate for a more in-person, these more in-person meetings today? And would there be any differences, you think?
This is a great question. And something I did a presentation at the Society for Community Research and Action annual meeting about, because we did an in-person version of this that next year. And so it was really easy to sort of compare. I do think from doing it in Zoom and then doing it in person, there's affordances and challenges to both. Something that was kind of nice doing it via Zoom is that students could provide feedback. We had they could type things into the chat. They could message me directly. Some of them would if they were not following, but felt embarrassed unmuting and asking themselves. Especially also having the research assistants, they could sort of easily be communicating with them. So I think in that way, there were some nice things for sort of having different modalities in which students could participate and share their voices depending on what they were comfortable with. And I think there's a different sort of like classroom management, for lack of a better term, looks different
Mm-hmm.
online than in person. When we were doing things in person, that next year, it was a lot more of like small groups and coming back together and doing votes and things like that. So that group felt much less cohesive than the Zoom group did, and because it was just a little bit easier to facilitate whole group and small group in Zoom. Um, so I think those were some affordances to it. And I know prior to the pandemic, there was some research on online YPAR as a way to like connect students in rural areas or do things that are sort of more far-reaching geographically. I do think the trade-offs are, some of the things that came up in a lot of spaces around the pandemic is, unequal access to resources in terms of, I think for all the students who signed up, even if maybe they didn't have the best working devices, we could find ways for them to be involved, even if it was voice only, or we had some students that were even like chat only because they had, it wasn't quiet enough for them to talk. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are students that would have wanted to be involved that couldn't even, they didn't have Wi-Fi access or things like that. So I think that doing it on campus, can eliminate some of that. But yeah, there's lots of different factors and choice points. And I would say my takeaway is one's not better than the other. They just have
Mm-hmm.
different implications.
Okay, okay. We have a question here, a couple of questions. Thanks so much. So it sounds like the program improved some outcomes, but not necessarily school level climate, right? So you
Mhm.
showed that.
Yeah.
What about students who didn't participate? As you reflect, what do you think is the best way to go in improving school-wide climate versus microclimates? Or do you see them as one and the same?
This is a great question and something I think about a lot. And I know also, Francis, given your work on school climate measurement is also something. I mean, it was interesting because before this, so I specifically worked with the positive behavior interventions and support team at this school. And it was really, we were doing much more sort of broad school climate interventions, and thinking about, here's overall how students are experiencing school climate. What are the things that are most sort of in need of movement? Especially, we're really focused on discipline procedures there. And so I think this process, hearing from parents of students involved, it seemed like it was really highly impactful, but it was also so limited. And so certainly when it comes to things like scalability of YPAR, like there are some folks, Emily Ozer's team at Berkeley, I think does a lot of great work on like partnering with entire districts and doing more of a train the model or train the trainer model, to make it that you can have these kind of, interventions happening in multiple classrooms at once, versus for this, it wasn't necessarily going to be applicable. So I do think it would have been interesting to have, because like we had some processes for the students where, once they had identified the issue they thought were important, we asked them to like ask for friends. So then we did little things like that to be like, okay, how can we sort of get some more, feedback? I think as the study was originally designed, typically what you do in there's different sort of schools of thought about what is complete YPAR. But ideally you have, your action that you undertake and then you evaluate if that action was successful and you get feedback. And so I do think it would have been interesting for this study if we had, okay, here's the survey we got from the broader student body. Because of that, we're going to implement these new menu items. That's what we were moving towards, talking to the cafeteria team about. Then we're going to survey if students liked them. I think some of those efforts, if you have ideally a representative group in the YPAR process, and then you're moving to those action steps and then surveying the broader student population again, I think that can be a way to sort of like split the difference, so to speak, if you have this core team that's working really closely, but then ideally they're acting as, voices for other students on campus. And then even if a student's not in the YPAR group, they are like, oh, I did vote that I wanted this new kind of food served, and then it did happen. I think that can be helpful. As a way to think both about microclimates as well as the overall student experience. Like it didn't come up by the time we were doing this study because of the shift in the pandemic, but previously I know something from some of our other work about the school food specifically is there was a 7th and 8th grade lunch, or a 6th and 7th grade lunch, and then an 8th grade lunch period. And sometimes certain food items would be out by the 8th grade lunch period. This wasn't relevant during COVID because everything had changed, but
Mm-hmm.
I could imagine that have been another thing we would have had to think about, are we improving school food for everyone, or 8th graders still feeling like they're not getting access to some of this? So yeah, it's a little bit of back and forth.
Okay, okay. Um, we have another question as well. So thank you for sharing your research today. Could you talk a bit more about your measure that you use to assess school climate? I'm curious if the measure might not have captured the changes in student perceptions of school climate after YPAR, which is an interesting question because it depends
Definitely.
what kind. There's so many questions we can ask about school climate, right? So.
Yeah. No, I think this is a great question. And also, and I didn't talk about this in the presentation though, I talk more about the specific measures in the paper, but the school climate measure was the only one that was not a pre-existing validated measure. And the only reason we didn't use an existing school climate measure is we needed one that talked about school climate in a hybrid context, in terms of asking about like
Mhm.
online experiences. And so we looked at a lot of pre-existing school climate measures, and ended up, just none of them were going to work. So we created our own building off of those four categories of school climate, and adopting similar kind of wording but in an online context. So there's a very real chance that just in general that measure wasn't great because it was created, and normally that's never how I would do things, but it was just we could not find any measure that talked about, do you feel safe in your Zoom classroom? Um, but I do think, the empowerment measure that we used, psychological empowerment instrument that was created by Emily Ozer and a colleague, was specifically designed with YPAR in mind. And so, the mattering ones were not, but the empowerment one, I think, was definitely designed with that in mind. And so I think in that ways, the questions mapped on pretty nicely to the kinds of experiences students were having in terms of having their voices heard. And so I do think a general school climate measure, especially given that it was a online YPAR project, like asking things about, some of Adam Voigt's work has shown that some of the relationships on a school site can be improved by doing YPAR because they're talking to more students, they're talking to more teachers, things like that. I think there was some of that in this YPAR project, but not as much as usual because it was online via Zoom. They had that one presentation with to teachers, but it wasn't as sort of back and forth. So I do think, the ways in which maybe their perceptions of school climate were shifting may not have been adequately captured in what we were, in generally the measure we created, and also the ways in which we are sort of presenting school climate to them, given the current context and everything.
Okay. Now you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, you said you continued doing this. You had another year where you were doing this in person. Were
Mhm.
you also measuring school climate in
So
that
we
at that time?
we did it in that time. If Francis heard me talk a little bit about this, the transition from online to in person. So I'm a community engaged researcher, so everything I do is in partnership with schools. So because we had done, the last study, it being after school, it was very much sort of in my purview. I had followed a very sort of like traditional approach in terms of all the IRB and consenting and whatnot. And we had some delays in getting started the next year. We were hoping things would be smoother, but a lot of administrative turnover. So we had an assistant principal who was sort of signed on to help us with it. And then that person quit a month into the school year. So all that to say, by the time it came time to do this, the goal from the school was to have it embedded during the school day and make it more accessible for students to join. But because of that, we and eventually, after many different challenges that emerged, did it just as sort of like a service project to the school. So I wasn't doing formal measurement because we didn't do like a full round of the study in terms of the consenting process. So I do have, the facilitator reflections on some of the choices and
Mhm.
design. So I'm writing a paper about that, but we didn't end up measuring
Okay.
because of the nature of how that next year went.
Yeah, no, things are
Mhm.
quite different now. The people are back in the classrooms again.
Yeah.
Um, I was wondering also, would you have any tips or advice on how to improve student participation in YPAR when you talk
Mhm.
about recruiting students or
Yeah.
getting them to be engaged in that?
Mhm.
So would you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Because I will say the fact that this study occurred at all kind of felt like a miracle to me. Like when it came time to do recruitment, I was like, no student on campus knows who I am, and their parents are getting an email saying, like, do you want
That's
to
right.
talk about research on Zoom after school with some strangers?
Yes.
I was honestly amazed we got the participation we did. Definitely, I think at the start, a lot of any early kind of YPAR projects involve like team building exercises and trying to build rapport between, amongst the students as well as between the students and facilitators. So I think having that initial sort of relationship building as a foundation can be really helpful when it comes to participation. The other thing that was a little bit unique about this project, because of the pandemic, the school was not involved at all in the like facilitation of the meetings. Once, parents had consented, I was handling all the communication. And as a result, and this got approved by the IRB, the parents could say how they wanted me to be in contact with their child about to send them like the Zoom links. And a lot of them are like, just text my child.
Hmm.
And so often because students then had my phone number, which is not normally a thing I would do, but this is what called. I think they felt very comfortable. Like I would get student texts on Thursday being like, what are we supposed to do again? And so I think
Yeah.
having that direct access with me compared to when I've done other projects where I would never give them my personal contact info, it was just the nature of this. And again, what the parents could do to decide. I mean, some parents were like, I will give you my phone number and I will relay the information, which
Yeah.
is totally fine. So I think also, again, having those options for direct communication, I think also we did made sure that while they didn't have the contact information of the research assistants, they would also help me facilitate things. I mean, whenever the students sort of felt like uncomfortable talking about something, especially the two research assistants who'd gone to that school, they'd be like, well, I remember like I really hated the pizza or something. Is it still like that? And I think there was also,
Okay.
they felt like this person understands me and I can help. So I think whenever there's opportunities to have, someone who's maybe closer to the school than you are,
Hmm.
that can also help students feel more comfortable to share. And definitely, I think Zoom allowed for if no one was talking, can we go into small groups? Should we do a vote? Should we show a video and then like talk about school climate there? And then will that, spur their thinking about this? So I think there can be different sort of approaches to that. But I know sometimes when I've talked to other folks who want to do YPAR, it is kind of a different skill set. It's more akin to like being a teacher or a youth worker or something. And it's not something everyone necessarily feels comfortable with, but I think there's a lot of different sort of resources that we found online around like icebreakers or, facilitating things in an engaging way for your age group in particular.
Yeah, because I was wondering about that because you're having middle schoolers meet
Mhm.
with you and you're not the
Mhm.
teacher, you're
Yeah.
somebody outside. So the
Mhm.
level of trust for them to actually open up and be engaged in
Mhm.
the entire process. So,
Definitely. No, I think that is a continuous challenge. And this is something with a different paper I've been working on about this, like with the students, especially being middle school, I think it was easy for them to default to relating to me as a teacher. Like I said, they could call me by my first name, but so many of them would still do like Mrs. Renick or Miss Renick just because they felt like that's what they were supposed to do. And it was funny. I remember one student when they like were really stuck on something and couldn't make a decision, they were like, just tell us what we're supposed to do. Like, I'm sure you know. And I was like, that's not the point, but that was sort of what they were used to of like, well, you must have a secret thing you want us to do. You're just not
hmm.
telling us. So I do think that is continuously challenging, especially at this age range where I think they still really defer to adults as authority figures. I've talked to some people who do YPAR with like 11th and 12th graders, and I think there that can be a little bit less challenging.
Hmm. Okay, great, great. We have time for another question if there's someone else who might want to pop something in the Q&A section over there. While we're waiting though, I will ask another question though. My question would be, what is next for you in this?
Yeah. So yeah, I've been at the University of Memphis for a year and a half now. And so my research interests are still the same in terms of both school climate generally. So I've been starting to build some relationships with the public schools here and are in the process of doing some data collection, though it's not YPAR, it's more traditional data collection on perceptions of school climate. And then I've been lucky that here we have there's the University of Memphis where I'm at, and there's also Rhodes College, which is a liberal arts college here. Um, where there's a faculty member there who does some YPAR work, and there's another person on campus here. So in partnership with those two universities, as well as some youth serving organizations in the community, they created something called the Memphis YPAR Collaborative. And we meet once a month and are trying to do some collective YPAR projects in terms of thinking about, there's some existing, like in some of the state like local government, some youth advisory boards that we've been trying to help with their data collection. And then also thinking about eventually, where would it make the most sense to launch a YPAR project here? So right now it's been sort of more relationship building. Typically, for me, when it comes to YPAR, it does require, I think, a lot more trust on part of the like participating school. Like I would not
Hmm.
have, suggested doing a YPAR study until a couple years in because it meant so much direct interaction between me and students. So right now I just see it more as like I'm laying the foundation to hopefully maybe like next year we could start something new.
Hmm.
And also just understanding the local context too. Not only was I waiting to build trust to start this project with the previous school I worked with, but also in recognition of, what are their pre-existing goals and how can I make sure whatever I'm proposing is aligned with what the school wanted overall. And they had expressed in some of those PBIS meetings that they wanted more student voice. So I was like, okay, that's the way I can make sure this is also working towards their goals too.
Okay, great, great. Now, there are no more questions here, so and we're near our end of the hour over here. So if there are no more questions, I think we can safely close our session. But before that, just a reminder that April 13, we'll have our special interest group meeting at AERA. So make sure to check that out. You're all invited to that. And try to attend our talks and presentations during AERA if you happen to be there. So you'll hear a lot of great speakers talk about different topics. So with that, thank you very much, Dr. Renick, and stay tuned next time for for further announcements about other talks in our series about school, community, culture, and climate. Thank you very much, all of you who have attended today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.